Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to ask my panelists to join the conversation. And as they turn on their video, I wanted to welcome all of our attendees to the Future of Public Space, North Brooklyn Parks Alliance panel series to share a green platform for North Brooklyn. It's a year-long panel series that North Brooklyn Parks Alliance started last fall when we began taking a look each month at a different parks infrastructure project in light of the pandemic and to see how things changed and how the pandemic was impacting parks in our community. So this afternoon, we are kicking off the second part of that series because 2021 is a different year than 2020. It's a highly political election year where we have a new mayoral administration. We have every borough president and we have 2/3 of the city council all up for election. So we thought no better time than to take a step back, ask our partners to join us and talk about the politics and culture of parks in North Brooklyn. So I am very pleased to welcome some of our longest standing neighborhood partners from the Newtown Creek Alliance, El Puente, and North Brooklyn Neighbors. And in particular, I am incredibly pleased to welcome Marco Carrión, who has agreed to moderate this evening. He is ideal to kick off this panel series talking about politics and policy, not only because he is the new executive director of El Puente as of December, but he hails from the mayor's office. So he has both an insider's and now an outsider's perspective of the ongoings of politics. So as previous commissioner of the Community Affairs Unit, we welcome you to North Brooklyn, and I wanted to say hello and introduce you to the community. So welcome, Marco.
Katie, thank you so much. You're way too kind, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you to North Brooklyn Parks Alliance. You know, this is I've only been in the position for about 2 months, but I mean, this is a great way to really meet the audience and to hear some amazing presentations. So I don't want to talk for too long. I just want to really introduce the speakers we have today. We're going to be hearing from Masoom Moitra, who's the director of El Puente's Green Light District, Anthony Buissereth, who's the executive director of North Brooklyn Neighbors, and Lisa Bloodgood, director of Advocacy and Education for Newtown Creek Alliance. We're all going to be making some really amazing presentations, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. But let's start off with Masoom, who's going to talk about Nuestro Aire, our air. Masoom.
Okay, so hi, I'm Masoom Moitra. I'm a community planner, designer, and also director of El Puente's Green Light District. Thank you for having us here, Katie. I'll be talking a little bit about El Puente's campaign for clean air, community wellness, and healthy open spaces called Nuestro Aire, our air, and I'm going to be talking with a lens on equity and self-determination and focusing on the south side of Williamsburg. The issues exist both in the south side of Williamsburg and Buissereth and other areas in North Brooklyn, but our focus today will be on south side Williamsburg. So for those who, I'm sure a lot of people know about the history and legacy of El Puente, especially here in the North Brooklyn community. But just to give a little bit of context, El Puente is a community human rights institution that promotes leadership for peace and justice in Southside Williamsburg, in Buissereth, and is of course a pioneer in the fields of environmental justice, cultural organizing, social justice education in all of Brooklyn and New York City. It was founded in 1982 by Luis Garden Acosta, who you can see here, with Gino Maldonado and Francis Lucerna, who is our president, and who actually was speaking in the first installment of this seminar with Katie and others. So El Puente, and this history is important because we know that there's a lot of work going on in the environmental justice movement right now around these issues. But El Puente had led some of the beginning struggles in Brooklyn, and some of the victories had included the limiting of the activities of a radioactive hazardous waste storage facility in Williamsburg called Radiac. They also worked with an alliance to topple the development of a 55-story incinerator, which was some of the big wins at that time. We are also co-founder of New York City's Environmental Justice Alliance, which fights for waste equity, cleaner public transportation, and green infrastructure. And some of our work today is still being done in partnership with NAJA. One of the things that really is meaningful for the work I'm going to speak about today is that in the 90s, led by Luis Garden-Acosta, El Puente had actually led one of the first peer-reviewed peer-reviewed studies on asthma, which was actually led by citizen scientists and community-based scientists. And there were around 5,000 people who had reached out to Southside neighbors to really understand what the situation with asthma, with air quality was at that time. And even now that is considered one of the leading studies in the field, especially in the field when it comes to community science and in the field of environmental justice scholarship. So all the work we're doing now is really building on that rich legacy in many ways. So the Green Light District started about 10 years back, and it's El Puente's initiative in holistic self-development, and especially responding to the rapid gentrification that Luis and all his fellow leaders saw around happening in both Williamsburg and in Bushwick. And one of the main goals of the Green Light District is to flip this disempowering narrative around gentrification and really say that as a community, we are not only trying to understand and spread awareness about issues, but also taking the solutions in our own hands and trying to also make sure that we recognize the knowledge of residents as knowledge that can actually address some of the pressing issues. Another thing, and this is important as we talk about air quality, is that we don't look at issues in silos. So as I talk about air quality, I'm also going to be talking about open spaces. I'm also going to be talking about health and wellness, about political education, about cultural organizing, because all of these, we really take a holistic approach and try to make sure that we are looking at these issues as being very connected. And El Puente has always had a legacy of using arts and culture to win many of these fights. So just going back to this issue of air pollution, this is not a new issue. It's been there for decades. And one of the main reasons for poor air quality is, of course, especially where we are located, where El Puente is located, it's at a very problematic intersection between the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, Williamsburg Bridge, and the bus depot that's in the same neighborhood, which makes it like a toxic triangle of sorts. There's also a lot of emissions from industrial activities and trucks, because it's a heavy truck route that goes to many of these industrial users. As you can see in this map here, we know that the BQE is also has a big racist legacy, which is why it cuts through, along with many other highways, cuts through low-income and moderate-income communities of colors like ours. And you can see here how it cuts straight through parks and open spaces in the area, which really means that the most vulnerable members of the community, which is young people and seniors, who are the biggest users of these parks and open spaces, are also the most vulnerable to asthma, respiratory diseases, cancer, and also shorter lifespans. So you can see that that's a huge moral crisis, in that people literally have shorter lifespans because this issue is not being addressed in the way it should be. On top of everything, we also have significantly less open space in comparison to other parts of New York City. And the open spaces we do have are severely neglected. We don't have playgrounds that are as clean as even other playgrounds in North Brooklyn or well maintained. So we've been doing a lot of interviews right now. And most parents, grandparents will say that they have to take their kids and grandkids to parks that are much further away, to McCarran and Domino and other parks, but they cannot use parks on the south side because there is no park in walking distance for them that's actually healthy, not just in terms of toxic air, but also in terms of the physical infrastructure and the level of maintenance. In terms of air pollution, one of the statistics which isn't as well known is that rates of asthma-related hospitalization for children and adults in Williamsburg and Bushwick are double those of folks in Brooklyn and New York City overall. Now we know that this is an issue of systemic racism and environmental racism, because sources of pollution are more likely to be cited in communities of color and low-income communities. So we remind everyone that this is a moral crisis, in that essentially we are still perpetuating systems of racist infrastructure that have been passing through this community for decades. Halfway through our campaign, we were also hit by COVID-19, which exposed some of the worst impacts of air quality, because as a recent Harvard study has shown that people living in more polluted neighborhoods, people living in neighborhoods with low air quality are more likely to face the deadliest impacts of COVID-19. So people in cleaner parts of the country were less likely to die from COVID-19. And we know that COVID-19 has, of course, affected Latino and African-American communities, especially those in low-income communities, much worse than everywhere else, in New York City especially. So we know that this has really compounded it and made this issue more urgent than ever before. So in response to all of this, really the Our Air Nuestra Aire campaign came around in 2019, in the summer of 2019. And we again are trying to respond to this issue, not just in one way, but in many different ways, of which air quality monitoring is one of the things, and actually the foundational things on which everything else was built. But we also had as a part of this campaign, we had the awareness raising and political education aspect, advocacy, the cultural organizing in arts, and the mitigation planning and design. And we work with a huge coalition of partners and advisory committee members to get there. So the foundation is a youth-led citizen science project where 60 young people from our Williamsburg Leadership Center and from El Puente Academy High School collected data through mobile monitoring and through counting trucks. We also partnered with Queens College's Barry Commoner Center and the New York City Department of Health to install a network of stationary monitors throughout the neighborhood. There's some really nice photos here, so you can see some of our young people in action. We use low-cost portable sensors called air beams, which connected to phones. So the young people were using their own phones to do that. And these were co-located with more expensive high-quality sensors from the city's air monitoring system for stationary monitoring. We were mainly focusing on PM 2.5, which is the smallest and most dangerous particulate matter. And though we wanted to get a sense of the neighborhood overall, we were focused on parks and schools in the area. We were mainly doing it in partnership with Queens College and the DOH, but also with NIJA and the Heimbinder Foundation. And of course, the New York Community Trust was funding the overall effort. We also are right now in the process of analyzing much of this data, and that has been an ongoing process, and there have been certain barriers in that. How do we translate, a very dense scientific data into data that actually translates into the everyday lives of our community members, and how we can actually make that connection. But we are in that process now. NIJA has also just recently released their report about citywide, their work at a citywide level. And we are working with Queens College on that as well, and MIT as well, a student from MIT. This work really builds on a study we did in 2016 as well, which is called the Urban Lab for Open Spaces, which actually came out with a finding that at its peak, the air quality levels at LaGuardia Park, which is the park right across El Puente, is 4 to 6 times higher than that recommended by national standards, which is pretty alarming. One of the things that has remained consistent in all our air quality work, and which is why we have come to a conclusion that no matter how much more air quality data monitoring we do, the conclusion is always the same, that even though the air quality has improved in the rest of the city, and even in Brooklyn overall, the air quality and the public health situation, especially in terms of respiratory disease, remains the same for decades in our particular community. And this is unacceptable. This is something that we do not find to be conducive, especially now that there's COVID-19 to grapple with. And we want to call for urgent action on this matter. We are also supplementing our air quality studies with oral history interviews that capture the lived experiences of residents and how they've grown up with a history through generations, really, at this point, with a history of respiratory illness from playing in parks, from being exposed to these fumes, and without that being addressed for a very long time. So almost every person on the street, when you go talk to them, some people do know about how toxic the air is in the parks, but most people are not really aware of how dangerous the situation is and how much we need to organize and come together. So the last 2 years, we've also been doing a lot of cultural organizing and trying to translate this dense data into theater, into puppet shows, into plays, a very El Puente style of popular education. Even as COVID hit, we tried to take all the precautions, go online, do social media advocacy, go to where people are, go to classrooms, and really do the political education around this, including hosting bilingual community forums. We also want to, of course, connect this issue through our youth leaders to the bigger climate issues that are currently unfolding in the city and around the world. And there's a lot of social media advocacy that has been happening. We also have started a petition that has gained more than 1,300 signatures. So we know that a lot of people are concerned about this issue in the community and want to take action. All this goes to say that this work for the last 2 years has not just been about awareness raising, but also about collecting community input and collecting community knowledge about how do we solve this issue. So not just have we been reaching out to community members for solutions, but also consulting with technical experts, with academic partners, with community leaders and organizations all around North Brooklyn to come up with a 5-point action platform. Now, this is a platform that we are advocating around in this election season, and we want to hold folks accountable to even after that. So the 5 points include the right to breathe clean air. We are also putting together a public health emergency and resiliency task force so that we can come together as North Brooklyn, in a more comprehensive way around when there are public health disasters like COVID. Then health as a human right, cultural organizing, awareness raising and education, and greening for a safe future. So this point is important because, when people hear about this air quality issue, a lot of people ask that, okay, so what do you want to do? What do you want us to do about it? So what we are saying is we already know what we want to do about it. Here are the 5 points. Here are the recommendations. Here are the solutions. What we want your help is in actually implementing these, because there are many structural barriers and issues of equity that we face when we go and try to implement many of these solutions. The solutions are good, but they present us with the actual issues of equity that we hear about over and over again, but we don't really know the details of. So just to give some examples of, you can see this beautiful green wall here, and something that we are trying to do, that we want to model how green walls can look along parks that line the BQE. And we want LaGuardia Park to be a pilot for that project so that that can be replicated and scaled up in parks that are actually being torn through by highways throughout the city. But we haven't been able to even figure out what the jurisdiction is for the space in between the park and the BQE. Every agency sends us to the next one. So we know that interagency coordination is an equity issue because the onus of that falls on under-resourced organizations like ours, and that shouldn't be the case. Then we have another idea about closing one of the streets that actually cuts through 2 of the open spaces in the area, through the Open Streets program, through the Plaza program, which are both really good programs, but they require a lot of volunteer capital. And we know that volunteer capital is available more to wealthier communities. And we have so many community members who have multiple jobs, who work on frontline and who are essential workers, and who can't volunteer in the same capacity as wealthier communities. And actually that inequity in these programs have been studied by, and there are several different studies that have been published. So we are getting like different members of our coalition to help us with this, but we need to keep, exposing these issues of equity and then making sure that we reinforce them with solution. There's also the issue of budget inequity, because many of these even the smallest of capital changes, like changing ground cover from concrete to grass, these are huge astronomical capital costs. And the kind of budget that's given to some of these parks that have been neglected for decades can not at all cover many of these urgent changes that are needed to actually deal with the environmental justice issues here. And because there's budgeting inequity, we also see that even dog parks that are in the same neighborhood receive more than double the funding of some of the parks that have the worst levels of air pollution in this neighborhood. This is again a moral crisis, as from what we have seen. There's also the matter of public input. Many of these parks have been renovated and are being renovated, and there has been a public input process. But we propose that this input process from the city side needs to be much deeper, much longer, and needs to acknowledge for the environmental justice issues, not just for the recreational issues around open spaces. Because ultimately, even when there's money that goes into, because money has to be distributed through the lens of equity, but even when money is poured into an environmental justice community like ours, it needs to happen through the lens of self-determination. There should be awareness raised around the issue, and then it should be in the hands of people. We should be consulting platforms like Nuestro Aire to see what is it that needs priority in terms of implementation. So we know that no matter how many air quality monitoring surveys we do as a follow-up to this, we know that all of it points towards the same direction, that this issue is a moral crisis and has been neglected for way too long. And this issue, because especially in the times of COVID-19, is not something that should be neglected any longer. And especially in terms of public health and parks, we need to make sure that policies are very unique to EJ communities and take into account the very specific needs that we have, which means that, authentic equity, not the buzzword equity that we hear everywhere, but real equity that talks about all of these issues that I just outlined. In terms of getting involved and taking action, this is the last slide, I promise. There are many ways. We know that we can do none of this by ourselves, and El Puente has never done any of this throughout the history by ourselves, which is why we work with all of you to do it. So we invite you to join our working groups and task forces. Each of these points in the platform have a working group. We are also doing community forums and green table talks to raise awareness and mobilize around the campaign. With the other wonderful panelists in this group, we are also part of an open spaces equity coalition where we're developing a platform and a candidate forum to ask these questions together. We also are hosting a youth-led town hall around environmental justice, and we have a group of parents who are doing park action days around this. We also want to advocate for green zone legislation that really calls for a comprehensive kind of action in terms of policy. And making sure that this neighborhood is counted when it comes to environmental justice and climate funds. We also are working a lot around cultural organizing. We're doing oral history interviews, public service announcements, community theater, art exhibitions that talk about this issue. And we continue to do research, data visualizations, and analysis that actually so that we can use this air quality data as a tool and as an instrument for advocacy, just like some of the other groups are doing. So with that, I'll end it and I'll pass it back on to Marco. And thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much. That was really informative, and you gave a real good kind of overview and also historical perspective to the work that we're doing, the work that you're doing with the Green Light District. I'd like to mention before I turn it over to Anthony that please everyone look at the chat. We have everyone's bio in the chat and some additional information. So please look at the chat. And with that, I will turn over to Anthony, talk about the Neighborhood Air Monitoring Initiative. Anthony.
Thanks, Marco. Let me share. Thank you all again for hosting this. I'm Anthony Buissereth, Executive Director of North Brooklyn Neighbors. So the air work that we do at North Brooklyn Neighbors is both specific, but is related to kind of the work that we've historically done. North Brooklyn Neighbors was founded in 1994 as Neighbors Against Garbage, really about shutting down waste transfer stations on the waterfront. And one of the complaints many of the neighbors had about the waterfront like garbage dumps was the air that and the dust that came from the dumping on the waterfront. So it's always doing air work has always been related to our historic work. But specifically the project that we're working on now. There have been a lot of concerns about the polluting effects. Many of you might remember, like in 2019, there was a big concern in Greenpoint about the smell of noxious gases, and no one really knew what the source was. And the confluence of all of these like growing number of complaints, particularly around construction, et cetera, led us to start a neighborhood air monitoring initiative. And one of the reasons we started is because because exposure to particulate matter specifically can really challenge folks with respiratory illnesses. And as Masoom said, folks in Williamsburg particularly have higher rates of asthma, et cetera, especially among children. This is also related to another project that we work on, which an initiative to electrify school buses. There are a lot of bus depots and truck routes in the neighborhood, and as we know, school buses are one of the largest contributors to diesel emissions. So that was another reason for us to pursue this line of work. So in 2018, NICAS, which does air surveying throughout the city, reported that typically seasonal PM 2.5 is between 3.4 and 16.5 parts per million, and North Brooklyn is on the higher end of that range. So when we talk about PM 2.5, what does that actually mean? So if you look at this graphic, this hair follicle is 50 to 70 microns in diameter, and the fine piece of sand is 90. So you can typically fit, most dust and pollen and mold is 10 PM. So that's like about 10 microns. So you can usually fit 5 to 7 in the width of a human hair. 2.5 is actually a quarter of that size. And if it's embedded, it comes from all sorts of combustion particles, et cetera. And it can actually deeply embed in lungs. So it's really can cause a lot of stress if you have a respiratory condition over the long term of exposure. So that's one of the reasons that we chose to just do this type of monitoring, because it can give us a sense of the type of exposure that's in the neighborhood. So as part of the initiative, we Puente uses the air beam. We have two types of monitors. We have the purple air and the air beam, and we actually had them at fixed locations throughout the neighborhood. We did not use the mobile aspect, and we just collect real-time data on those locations from volunteers who decide to be part of the program. So as long as folks have, access to Wi-Fi and a power source, the monitors will typically just gather the data. And over time, with our partners at NYU, they track and reveal the spikes that happen throughout the neighborhood. Typically, the spikes happen early mornings when construction is revving up in many parts of the neighborhood. There's also near acute locations of emissions. There's also spikes when those businesses or emitters are operating. So those are the things that we track and try to identify when the air is dangerous for residents. But the other concern is that PM doesn't identify what's actually in the air. So, and this is another challenge for folks, because even if folks are not only concerned that they're breathing in these particles, but they also are concerned about what it is they're breathing in. So we have this other aspect of our work that's funded by DEC, state DEC, to kind of reveal what's in the air. So we have summer canisters. So that's the big thing with a little hook top, and it sucks in air for about 6 hours at a time. And it'll tell you what kind of VOCs are in the air. And we have these puff cartridges, which is this little thing next to it that measures air for 24 hours at a time. It has like a little sponge tube, and the air flows through it. That measures PAHs. And then it's a tool that you don't see here was the Teflon filter, which is like a XRF kind of related machine. It's like a magnet that pulls all the heavy metals that are in the air for 2 hours. So you get a sense of what type of particles are in the air. And then we get those analyzed, and we kind of, to figure out what's in the air. So just a quick thing on PAHs and VOCs. So essentially, these are gaseous things that have sometimes have an odor. They are, just things that you actually can't touch, but you always are breathing in. And so that's one of the primary reasons we do this work. So far, we've done this test at about a handful of sites throughout the neighborhood. We have about another half dozen to do. And then the plan is to share that data more richly with folks about the specific types of sources of pollutants in the neighborhood. So yeah, future directions, as I said, definitely identify more testing sites for VOCs and PAHs. We're also going to do that study more in the spring and early summer. And the later this year, we'll release all of the final data to the community and policymakers, and perhaps come up with recommendations on ways to move forward with what's in the air. Masoom was able to give a really good background on the type of environmental issues that the community has faced. We have a map that, amongst the things that it does, it talks through the environmental legacy, but also compile on the interactive version of it. It compiles all sorts of air complaints that come in through the city. You can track where the hot spots are. So I think Katie has the link to it. You can feel free to share, look at that, and you can actually visualize where the upticks are. And then our goal is kind of match those upticks and those complaints with what we're measuring in the neighborhood.
Anthony, thank you so much. There was a really good explanation on the technical side. I'd like to remind everyone to look at the chat. Now I'm going to turn it over to Lisa. Lisa, you're with Newtown Creek Alliance. I'm looking for the name of your project. It's not here. So I heard that you were looking to this event to crowdsource a name for your initiative. So maybe when we get to the Q&A, we can come with a snazzy, catchy name for it. I know that the work you're doing is amazing. So Lisa, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Marco. I really appreciate that. And yeah, it's true. We're unlike our neighborhood partners who have been doing this work for a while now, we are just embarking. So let me share my screen. So I just want to, before I really get started, thank everyone. Thank North Brooklyn Parks Alliance, Katie and Lynn for hosting these series and for inviting Newtown Creek Alliance and myself to join. We're in really good company and we're very aware of that. So I'm Lisa Bloodgood. I'm the Director of Advocacy and Education with Newtown Creek Alliance. I've worked for the organization since 2017. And yeah, so what I'm going to talk about today is even probably a little bit more technical than what Anthony was able to share. And so bear with me, and I hope to be able to answer any questions that you guys might have. So a little bit of context. So this is all of North Brooklyn. You see Newtown Creek is the border on the left, which is actually north. You see Wallabout Channel is that little inlet that's jutting in, which is the start of the Navy Yard. And so, you know, we're really, really surrounded by water in so much of North Brooklyn. And I think it's always important to start these conversations with a little bit of context visually as to like where we are and what we're looking at, what we're talking about, especially if perhaps somebody that is not of the North Brooklyn community wants to hopefully view this presentation in the future. This context is a little helpful. And then I'm rotating the map now, and I apologize to our neighbors in the south side for kind of cutting a little bit of the community off, but you know, Newtown Creek really hugs the north side of our community, and that's Community Board 1. And so we have Greenpoint and East Williamsburg and Bushwick really surrounding Newtown Creek on the Brooklyn side of things. And something I want to just point out when looking at this map is you can see, like in the center of the community, it's very, these are residential neighborhoods, and closer to the creek, you can see the blocks get much bigger. There are significantly less green spaces, no trees on the streets. And this is the industrially zoned, significant industrial maritime area, or SMEA, it's known as the Newtown Creek industrial area. And so really quickly, a little bit about, I should have said this initially, but Newtown Creek Alliance, we were founded in 2002. Really by a group of concerned Greenpoint citizens that were really worried about the horrendous conditions of not only the waterway, but of the industrial businesses surrounding the waterway. Quite frankly, Newtown Creek is a mess. And so our mission is to reveal, restore, and revitalize Newtown Creek. And that is bringing people to the waterway to show its not only its problems, but its inherent beauty and solutions towards fixing it. Providing public access, we think, is also an environmental justice issue and a right. We should have access to our shared waters. And the revitalize portion of our mission is really all about the industrial businesses and having a healthy and robust industrial area that so many people in our communities use as, you know, their sources of incomes and their careers and their livelihoods. But what do those businesses look like in the context of environmental justice and thinking about encroaching rising waters with climate change, the urban heat island effects and the vulnerabilities associated with those things, and how can we bring our industrial community along with us as we, you know, prepare for a cleaner, greener future. So that's a little bit about Newtown Creek Alliance, and I encourage you to check out our website and learn more about us and all of the many things that we do. But so I wanted to just show some maps. I often think in maps, and I'm going to toggle back and forth between this slide that I showed you that really you can see the difference between the residential neighborhoods and the industrial neighborhoods and what that looks like. And so this is a zoning map, which you can go and take a look at on your own. This is a zoning and land use map, and all of those purple and violet colors, that's all the industrial zoned areas. And you can see they're really very close to the residential areas. And so when you have industrial and manufacturing uses. Oftentimes there is not only the associated truck traffic and all of the air pollution that comes along with those vehicles, but then just the emissions and other releases that these businesses are permitted to release. So oftentimes there's a conflict in these where these zones meet. And this, I think, is also really important maps to show. On the left here, you see this New York State environmental justice maps, and all of the purple areas are considered potentially environmental justice zones. And on the right, this is a newer, I just saw this for the first time actually last week. This is a New York City environmental justice map, whereas the light blue here is the potentially environmental justice communities, and the dark blue are the environmental justice communities. And I think if I were to pull up a federal map, it would show also slightly different areas. And so I think there's something in our advocacy here where we should really be working to align the city, the state, and the federal definitions of what is environmental justice communities. And New Jersey just passed a fantastic law just last year. But I think there's a lot of work that New York City can do or New York State can do to really more clearly define some of our environmental justice communities so that we can potentially have better laws and regulations around them. But also want to point out how those same areas, those industrial areas that are right up against these residential communities often are the environmental justice communities. And so there's often this overlap, and Masoom spoke very eloquently about the challenges that environmental justice communities face. And so I think, having this image as context for the work that we're trying to do with air quality around the creek this coming year and in the future, I think is really important to kind of hold in your mind as we talk about the rest of the work that we're doing. So this is a phenomenal photo. This shows North Brooklyn, the street closest to the bottom of your screen. This is Bridgewater, which turns into Norman Avenue. And that first street on in from the creek, that's Kingsland Avenue. And that large facility in the center, this was ExxonMobil, this was Standard Oil, this was an enormous oil refinery that was on the banks of Newtown Creek, which ultimately led to lots of other pollution in the ground and in the water, and I'll get a little bit more to that. But I just wanted to point out, if you just spend a minute and look at this photo, you see all of the different smokestacks, and they're not only from oil refineries, but other chemical refineries. You see the Greenpoint incinerator in the background. Let me see it with my mouse here. So this was the Greenpoint incinerator here. This facility here is no longer the same, but across the way there's currently a facility that has a lot of emissions that aren't necessarily monitored in the way that we would like. So also just kind of keep in mind that facility as I continue to talk. So our air quality around the creek is significantly better than when we had all of this industry, but that legacy is now in the sediments and in the waterway and in the land surrounding the waterway. And so we got federal Superfund designation back in 2010, and there's some information about that on your screen now, but I think what's important to point out is that since 2010, we've been in this phase called the remedial investigation, where that is the EPA and the responsible parties and the CAG working with these groups, trying to really understand the extent of the pollution that's in the waterway. And so 10 years in, we're still in that kind of discovery phase. We're almost to the next step, which is more of like a feasibility study and what can be done to address the extent of the pollution. But 10 years in, we're still looking at it. And I think that's a really powerful indicator of the extent of the pollution that's there and kind of a lack of political will to really move this this process forward. In part, I think it's because of the industrial nature of the waterway. There are less people that are there with their eyes on it every single day, complaining about it, which is also part of how we view our organization is really the eyes on the creek, so that there is some sort of political pressure to move that process forward. So I will talk a little bit more about being involved in the Superfund process in a little bit. But to get to all of that contamination and the pollution that was generated over the course of the century that it was really heavily industrialized, much of that contamination is in the surface and subsurface sediments of the water. And that is really important in the context of what I'm about to get to. So PCBs, these chemicals are no longer used. And I think this slide is really kind of hard to see what's going on or to read. But the important thing here, and remember again, those environmental justice maps, the sections that have the red bars and the numbers in those little squares, this is where you're seeing the highest concentrations of PCBs in surface sediments. And so you can see they're all kind of in the back of the creek and in and around those environmental justice communities. And the same with PAHs, which are polyaromatic hydrocarbons, which Anthony explained a little bit. They are a byproduct of the combustion process and are definitely related to oil, gas refining. And so these things are in the waterway itself, but we see them sometimes coming to the surface, and we don't necessarily really understand how these contaminants can move around in the waterway. So are they just sitting at the bottom? Do they ever bubble up? Do they move with the tides? All of these things are questions that we're trying to get answers through the Superfund process. But this is a very unique phenomena that's coal tar ebullition. So ebullition is a very complicated sounding word, but it's really very simple. So if you've ever been, you know, when it's low tide and you can really smell the smell of low tide, that's all that decomposing matter that's at the bottom. That's a very normal smell. And when the tides are low, there's not a whole lot of pressure on the water. And so the gases that are produced during the breakdown of the organic matter that's down at the bottom of the waterway, and in this case, Newtown Creek, those gases are free to bubble to the surface because the pressure is less. And so what we see in Newtown Creek, and we also see it in Gowanus Canal and other similarly contaminated waterways, is that when it is low tide, we see coal tar bubbling up to the surface. That's the ebullition, is that bubbling up process. And so if we have these contaminants, coal tar, PAHs, PCBs, and other contaminants that stick to the air bubbles as they come up, once they hit the surface of the water, oftentimes they don't just stop there. They will also volatilize into the air. And volatilization is not explosions or anything like that. It's just, it becomes airborne. It goes into a gaseous phase. And so when you have coal tar ebullition on the creek and you know it's carrying these things to the surface and then up into the air, we have certainly questions about what that means to the surrounding air quality and to the workers that are nearby working and breathing that air. And then there's another non-natural complication to this, and that's the aeration system. And this is happening only in the back sections of the creek. So again, only where the contamination is the highest and where it is an environmental justice designated area by both the city and the state. And so this is basically, if you imagine a fish tank and you have your bubbler wand and it's blowing air into the water to provide oxygen for the fish that live in your fish tank, that's in principle the very same thing that this aeration system is. It's a series of pipes that go basically like PVC pipes that line the bottom of the creek, that blow oxygen into the water to support any marine life that can be found there. And yes, there is a lot of marine life that's surviving and in some cases thriving in the creek, including blue crabs, striped bass, really wonderful, wonderful animals. And so when you have this aeration system, that's like the ebullition times 1,000. And you can see in this image, it's really churning the water. And so we have a lot of concerns about what this means to air quality nearby. So to those ends, we are starting a project with NYU and their School of Environmental Medicine to look at the creek itself and the waterway itself as a source of pollutant exposure through these aerosolized contaminants. And so there's a lot of, this is taken specifically from our project plan. And so it's a lot of text, but we're going to be looking for PAHs, PCBs, and phthalates. Phthalates are plasticizers, basically, and they're endocrine disruptors. And your endocrine system is your hormone system. And so if you are exposed to phthalates, it can disrupt your hormonal systems, which, especially for young people, can be catastrophic as far as health concerns might. So we're looking at PAHs, PCBs, phthalates, and how they may move from the water up into the surrounding atmosphere, and what that might mean to if you breathe it. So we'll also be looking at what are these chemicals doing in the water, and how are they moving, and how are they bioavailable. So bioavailability is basically, is it going to stay in your body? Is it going to interfere with your biological processes? Things like that. And then also, you know, this use of these sampling methods for Superfunds are pretty common, but not the inclusion of phthalates. So that will be pretty interesting. And then, of course, the goal is to share all this information with the surrounding communities, with all of you, with anybody that's interested. And hopefully we can address that aeration system and those negative impacts. But then we have kind of another project that is more loosely defined, where you can tell by my screen, there's a lot of information that we can still source from you guys. Not only are we maybe looking to name this project, but we're also looking for other potential point sources. So where are some other sites that are the point of pollution? And are those recognized? Are they monitored effectively? How are they impacting surrounding communities? That's kind of the goal of what we're looking at. So it's not really Superfund, it's more the industrial area and how is that impacting surrounding community air quality. So if anybody has any sites that they're particularly interested in, I'd like to hear about it. And so this is, the EPA has a toxic release inventory, and this kind of addresses this need to understand some more local point sources. So in this map, you can see the little dot in the 11222 zip code. That is the wastewater treatment facility, and that is the bulk of the federally monitored releases, emission releases. But we know that's not the only location in that area in particular that has emissions that we might be concerned about. So for example, this is the Kingsland Wildflower green roof where Newtown Creek Alliance has our offices. Please do come visit us when we're open in the spring. And you can see we're right directly behind the Newtown Creek wastewater facility. And so you can see where my cursor is right here. These are flares, and they are kind of constantly running, burning the excess methane that's generated in these digester eggs, which is a whole other conversation. I'm not going to get into the methane production that's here. But if you look around the rest of this little map, you see here, this is fuel and oil storage, and they do a little bit of refining there. And you can see this little stack here. This is also, it's even a little orange in this photo. This is also a stack and a flare where emissions are being released into the atmosphere and the surrounding community. And, you know, one block down here, this is McGoldrick Park. This is residential areas. Additionally, our neighbor here, this is a company, they do construction and soil aggregate recycling, which is great. We absolutely should be recycling our construction material, our unused soils. They should not go to landfills. And so we love our neighbor, but they are not under a roof. All of the soil that they're sorting often gets blown onto the surroundings. And so we have questions about particulates that come from our neighbors to the west. And we have concerns about the VOCs, PAHs, and other combustion related and fossil fuel related emissions from our neighbor to the east. So, you know, we have good relationships with our neighbors, but that doesn't mean that we like what they're putting into the atmosphere. So this is just kind of an example of the proximity of all of these things in these neighborhoods and how some things are regulated and it's easy to find the information about them, but some are regulated in different ways and it's much harder to find any information about how these facilities might impact our air quality. And then I also really wanted to mention this point source in particular because they are currently looking to expand. So this is a national grid facility. It is very close to a couple of residential blocks, including Cooper Park houses, which is about a block and a half, 2 blocks away. And they are looking to expand and increase their emissions. And so one of the things that is currently released from this site and will, you know, arguably increase with that expansion are nitrous oxides. And the most, I'm not going to go through this entire slide. You can, you know, take a look at it, like take a screenshot or something, but the creation of nitrous oxides is another combustion formed compound, and it contributes to respiratory diseases. It contributes to the creation of ozone at, you know, at the like the street level, and it really it's not something that we can take more of in this neighborhood. So we're asking folks to attend a hearing the DEC is holding March 10th, and there's a link here, but I think Katie's also going to put one in the chat. And then there are some info sessions. There's one held this Sunday, and then there's one coming up next week if people want to learn more specifically about the expansion of this facility. But we are really interested in not only collecting information on what air quality is like currently now, but we'd also be interested in tracking the emissions from this facility, maybe over a longer period of time. And so this is my last slide. But I wanted to just reiterate again that we are just starting our air monitoring work. And I'm so grateful to, you know, our community partners for their leadership and kind of paving the way in showing like how it's done right, especially, you know, El Puente, you guys have done such a phenomenal job engaging youth, engaging the rest of the community in your work. I really look forward to to doing more of that with this project as well. So if there are people that live nearby or have concerns about a specific facility that's around the waterway, please do let us know. My email is there on your screen, and I will leave it at that. And thank you again for having me.
Well, I just wanted to take a moment to take a breather and reflect on all of the information that was just shared, which, part of the reason why we brought these partners together to talk about air quality is because of all of these very distinct approaches, reasons, and areas that these community organizations are looking at, all within Brooklyn's Community Board 1. This isn't citywide. This is really just in our Greenpoint, Williamsburg neighborhoods that these projects are happening. And I also wanted to give a nod to Masoom and Marco as well, because your work, which has been going on for years, indeed, a whole generation, is an inspiration for the title of this series when it's Whose Air, Your Air. It's a direct nod to your work with the Our Air campaign. And we felt like it was not only a good kickoff to these conversations about the issues our community is facing as we lead into a political year, but also a follow-up to our BQ Green panel that we had as our last discussion before we broke for the holidays, which was, a concept of decking over the BQE, in part because, Masoom, your deep dive and awareness of the health impacts of the air quality in that area. And that's one sort of higher level concept of intervention, in addition to some of the ones that you described and that are in your 5-point platform. So thank you all for really going deep into the work that you're doing, which is so valuable, and demystifying the various projects that we've all heard of, but it's good to hear it all in one place. And with that, I also wanted to mention that these 4 organizations have also come together in light of not only air quality, but other issues facing our parks and open spaces to put together, leading into 2021, a parks and open space platform focused on with an eye toward equity. So it's something that the 4 of us are working on, and you'll hear more about that soon as we lead toward an open candidates forum on August 29th. So Marco, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to, before we started to lose people with the Q&A, I wanted to just make sure I got that out there.
Thank you, everyone, for your presentations today, and everybody for joining us today. I know we're over time, and I want to turn it over to Katie to tell us about the next virtual panel on March 18th. So Katie, thank you so much for having me facilitate today's awesome presentations, and hopefully I can join again. Thank you, Katie.
Well, thank you, Marco. It was wonderful to meet you and introduce you to the North Brooklyn community as El Puente's new executive director. And I couldn't agree with you 3 more on your most recent comments, and Masoom about the implementation, and that's the collaboration and implementation, and that's sort of the impetus for our getting together to talk about these issues. North Brooklyn Parks Alliance next panel is on March 18th, and it's Whose Streets, Your Streets, and it's inspired by City Hall's Open Streets Initiative, the North Brooklyn Open Streets Community Coalition, which is an all-volunteer effort to support City Hall in that initiative to open up the streets back to the community. And we want to use that as a sort of sounding board to talk about just innovative approaches to finding new open space and essentially public amenities during this trying period for our communities. We obviously need more open space. There really isn't much out there left to develop as open space. So how can we use our streets, our plazas, the spaces underneath bridges, the spaces underneath highways, pathways in between parks? How can we use all of these to make a more interconnected green community for North Brooklyn. So join us on March 18th for that. I put the registration in. I've also got some links to keep in touch with us, North Brooklyn Parks website, past panel recordings, that's where this recording is going to be, or a place where you can ask a question about this panel that maybe you didn't get to while we were meeting on Zoom, but you have afterwards. So feel free to use any of those resources to be in touch. We will be in touch with you, Newtown Creek Alliance, El Puente and North Brooklyn Neighbors alongside North Brooklyn Parks Alliance will be sharing our conversations and findings about what we come up with some colleagues and advocates in the neighborhood for the open space priorities and platform. So you'll be hearing about that soon. And I wanted to thank all of these dear colleagues and partners for the conversation and for, again, just sharing the work that you're doing, which is so important and essential to our community. So thank you. And with that, I wish everyone a good evening and rest of your week. And we will see you on March 18th. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Good night.